Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
I should have known something would go wrong the moment Chloe texted me that morning, saying she might be a little late. Babe, don't wait for me to cut the cake. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Chloe being late was practically a family tradition, but that text came with a winking emoji and a heart, and somehow, that combination set off something small and unsettling in my stomach. A feeling I couldn't quite place at the time. I was standing in the middle of the decorated patio, one hand resting on my belly that had finally, after years of doctor visits, tears behind closed doors, and mornings filled with needles and hormone patches, begun to grow round and full like the dream I had almost given up on. Pink and white balloons were drifting lazily in the July breeze. The banner above the porch said, "Welcome, baby Madison," and for the first time in a long time, I felt like this day, this moment, was mine. It was quiet, soft, and warm in all the ways I had imagined during the years of aching for it. Friends from work were there, sipping lemonade out of mason jars and complimenting the cake shaped like a rattle. My mom was fussing over the cupcake tower with that same nervous energy she used to have during my high school recitals, asking if we needed more napkins or folding chairs, even though we had more than enough of both. My husband Tom, God bless him, kept sneaking little bites of frosting from behind the drink table, and every time I caught him, he gave me that sheepish grin like we were teenagers again. For a little while, it felt perfect. It felt like I had finally stepped into that soft-focused version of life everyone else had gotten to experience before me. I wasn't the woman getting invited to baby showers anymore. I was finally the one hosting one for my baby. For my daughter. And then, as the guests started gathering in a half-circle around the gift table, laughing and telling me to open theirs first, Chloe made her entrance. She swept in like a goddamn hurricane, all legs and hair, and the kind of confidence that doesn't need to be earned because it's been handed to you from birth. She was wearing a white silk dress, the kind that screams, "I didn't come here to blend in," paired with heels that clacked against the wooden deck with just enough aggression to say, "I'm here, and I want you all to look." The second she walked through the gate, heads turned, conversations paused, and someone even said, "Wow, you look amazing," as if she were the one pregnant, glowing, and the reason everyone was gathered that afternoon. She gave me a quick air kiss hello, barely touching my cheek, and said, sorry, traffic was a nightmare," before tossing her designer bag onto the nearest lounge chair like she was settling in for a photo shoot. I smiled, like I always do, and told her I was glad she made it, because that's what I'd been trained to do since we were kids: accommodate, make room, step back. Ever since we were little, Chloe could never just let me have anything that was mine. Not a birthday, not a college acceptance letter, not even a high school boyfriend once, and here she was again, right on schedule. As I sat in the wicker chair in front of the crowd and started opening gifts, onesies with silly sayings, books I'd read out loud at bedtime, tiny socks that made me tear up, I noticed Chloe standing just slightly off to the side, shifting her weight from one heel to the other, smiling too big, like she was waiting for her cue. Something was coming. I could feel it, thick and electric in the air, like the seconds before a summer storm. And then, just as I held up a soft pink blanket with Madison's name embroidered across it, Chloe cleared her throat loudly, did a little clap to get attention, and said, "Sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but I just can't wait anymore." Everyone turned. My mom looked confused. I froze, still holding the blanket in my lap. Chloe grinned wide, too wide, and raised her hand in the air, flashing a ring so shiny I could see the sunlight bouncing off of it from across the yard. "I'm engaged," she beamed, eyes glittering, face smug. "Jake proposed last night. I wanted to tell everyone earlier, but I just couldn't keep it in." The yard erupted in gasps, then applause, then the kind of oohs and ahs I had expected for my baby's name reveal. Not this. And then, as if her timing hadn't been calculated down to the second, she turned to me with that faux innocent smile and added, "Didn't mean to one-up you, Lore, but, you know." And she winked. She winked. The room, no, the world tilted, just slightly. I smiled back. I smiled like someone who hadn't just been sucker-punched in the middle of what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. I smiled like someone who hadn't spent the last 2 years enduring miscarriages in silence, injections that bruised my thighs black and blue, and nights lying awake wondering if my body was broken beyond repair. I smiled because if I didn't, I would have screamed. And screaming would have made me the dramatic one. Again. I smiled. And I made it through the rest of the afternoon with my head high and my spine straight, opening gifts and thanking guests while people whispered about Chloe's ring and tried to sneak glances at it from across the yard. I smiled through the cake cutting, the cleanup, the soft pats on my belly from well-meaning friends who were already asking if I'd be okay, sharing the spotlight. But when the last guest left, and the string lights above the patio buzzed softly in the gathering dusk, I went upstairs, opened the drawer where I kept a small velvet box I hadn't touched in years, and sat on the edge of my bed with it in my hand. Because inside that box, inside that tiny black case with the gold trim, was the ring her fiancé had once tried to buy from me. And the moment she stood there with that smirk, holding out her hand for applause, something inside me clicked. She thought she had the last word. She thought she had taken the spotlight again. But she had no idea what was coming next. It's strange how memory works, how something you thought you'd buried deep enough to forget can suddenly resurface in perfect, painful clarity, not as a vague feeling or a half-remembered blur, but as a sharp, uninvited reel of specific details, colors, words, smells unfolding inside your head like it just happened yesterday. And that night, after everyone had gone home and I was left sitting alone in the quiet of our bedroom with nothing but the hum of the ceiling fan and the faint scent of frosting still clinging to my shirt, I held that little velvet ring box in my hands and felt the weight of something I hadn't let myself fully confront in almost 3 years, the weight of what could have been, and the slow, humiliating burn of how it had all played out. Because before Chloe stole the show at my baby shower, before the ultrasound pictures and the gender reveal and the fight to even become a mother, there was Jake. Not Jake, the grinning fiancé with the tailored blazer and perfect stubble who now posed beside my sister on her Instagram like he was born to play the romantic lead in some Hallmark holiday special. No, I'm talking about Jake the client. Jake the casual flirt. Jake the man who sent me 3 months' worth of emails asking me to design a ring for the woman he said he couldn't stop thinking about, only, at the time, he never once mentioned that woman's name, and he sure as hell didn't say it was Chloe. It started with a message through my business site. I'd been making custom jewelry for years, nothing flashy or mass-produced, just small, detailed, handcrafted rings, usually for people who wanted something a little more personal than what you'd find in a mall. He said he'd found me through a mutual contact on LinkedIn, though to this day, I still don't know who that was, and he liked the look of my work. He said his girlfriend loved opals, and that he was looking for something non-traditional, something with character, something that didn't scream, I just walked into a jewelry store and pointed. He was charming, overly so, asking questions not just about designs and materials, but about where I learned the craft, if I ever took inspiration from old family heirlooms, if I believed that stones could hold memories. It was the kind of overly curious interest that made you feel seen, even though deep down you know it's probably performative, maybe even strategic, but it felt good at the time. At first, I kept things professional, but over the weeks, the tone started to shift. He told me he liked how detailed my messages were, that it was refreshing to talk to someone who didn't just slap together a template and call it customer service. He said he'd never met someone who talked about jewelry the way I did, like it was alive. One night, he sent me an email past midnight that simply read, "I've never been good at waiting. Makes me do stupid things." I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't respond to that one. The next morning, he apologized, said he was just excited, that he wanted the ring to be perfect, that his girlfriend was different from anyone he'd ever known. He told me he was thinking of proposing soon but was still trying to figure out the right moment. I spent weeks sketching out designs, sending photos of wax molds, even sourcing a specific type of black opal he'd mentioned offhand that I had to order from a dealer in Queensland. I poured hours into it, not because I thought we were falling in love, nothing so juvenile or romanticized, but because for once I felt like my work meant something to someone who saw beyond the product and into the process. And then radio silence. Just like that. 1 week, then 2. I followed up once, then again, and finally got a single line in response. Plans changed. Thanks for your time. That was it. No explanation, no feedback, no payment. Just gone. I chalked it up to another flaky client with more charm than commitment and tried to forget about it. The ring, still half assembled, went into a box in my closet, wrapped in soft linen with a note I never sent. I didn't want to throw it away, but I didn't want to see it either. It was a fragment of something unfinished, something that never quite made sense. Fast forward 2 months, and Chloe shows up at Thanksgiving with Jake. I remember that moment with eerie precision, as if my mind took a snapshot the second he walked into my parents' dining room carrying a bottle of Pinot and flashing the exact same smile he used in his emails. I must have stared at him longer than I meant to, because Chloe gave me one of those territorial looks she reserves for situations she doesn't fully understand but instinctively feels threatened by. She introduced him as her new guy, and he shook my hand like we were strangers, which, maybe we were, in his eyes. Maybe he genuinely didn't connect Lauren the jeweler with Lauren the sister-in-law-to-be. Maybe he never knew my last name. Maybe he was just a snake who slithered from one fantasy to the next, forgetting whose story he'd inserted himself into. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't say anything the following week or the month after that. Even when Chloe started posting beach pictures of them on vacation, even when she drunkenly called me one night to giggle about how he might be the one. I said nothing, because saying something would have meant dragging myself into a mess I wasn't sure I could cleanly explain, and at the time, it felt easier, safer, to play dumb. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I told myself people flirt, people ghost, people change their minds. I told myself he probably hadn't realized who I was, and if he had, then maybe he was just embarrassed, and maybe Chloe really didn't know. But deep down, beneath all the rationalizations, a seed of resentment had taken root, a small, tight thing that lived behind my ribs, whispering that once again, Chloe had taken something that didn't belong to her. Not just a moment, or a spotlight, or a compliment, but a piece of something that had started with me. And just like always, she had no idea. So when she stood in my backyard that afternoon, hand raised high like she was accepting an award, flashing a ring like she had no shame in the entire world, it wasn't just the audacity that burned. It was the symmetry. The cold, calculated full-circle moment of it all. Because while she thought she was revealing something brand new, I was remembering what had been taken. And as I sat in the quiet afterward, holding that little box and feeling the old ache creep back up into my throat, I realized I didn't just want to forget anymore. I wanted her to know. And that changed everything. There's a particular kind of anger that doesn't shout, doesn't flail its arms or slam doors, doesn't burn hot and reckless like a kitchen fire, but instead simmers slow, patient, deliberate, beneath the surface, biding its time like something ancient and coiled, waiting for the right moment to surface, not to explode but to exact. And in the days following the baby shower, as I moved through the motions of folding new onesies, organizing diapers into labeled bins, and writing polite thank you cards to guests who had already forgotten half the conversations they'd had in my backyard, I felt that anger settling into my bones like sediment, heavy and silent and certain. Not because Chloe had announced her engagement. Not even because she'd done it in front of my friends, my family, and my carefully arranged pink frosting dreams. No, what hollowed me out was the knowledge that she knew exactly what she was doing, knew it, relished it, and still looked me straight in the face afterward with that smug little smirk, that too casual, didn't mean to one-up you, as if her words weren't laced with the kind of malice only sisters are capable of. In the week that followed, I tried, at first, to brush it off the way I always had when it came to her, tried to convince myself that it didn't matter, that her announcement didn't really ruin anything, that my baby shower was still beautiful and filled with love, and that none of the guests would even remember her ring by the time Madison was born. But the truth was, I remembered. Every second. Every carefully calculated move. Every applause break she stole from me. And the more I tried to suppress it, the more it metastasized into something sharp and itching beneath my skin, especially when the messages started coming in. First, it was a group text from our mother, something sugary and useless about how wasn't it so nice to have the whole family together and how lucky both my girls are to be entering such exciting phases of life at the same time, followed by 100 exclamation points that made me want to throw my phone across the room. Then came the social media posts. Chloe, in her white silk dress, captioned, "I said yes," with a gallery of artfully filtered photos from my backyard, framed just right so that I looked like a background character in my own celebration. And when I didn't respond, didn't like the post or leave a comment like a good sister would, that's when she sent the text that changed everything. "I heard you used to make jewelry," she wrote, as if we weren't related, as if I hadn't sat across from her at Christmas dinners for the past 30 years. "Jake and I are thinking of designing our rings ourselves. But probably something a little more high-end, you know? He wants it to be special. No offense though, you've got a great eye." It was the kind of message that wore the skin of a compliment but was, underneath, nothing but a slap in the face. I read it twice before deleting it, and then sat for almost 10 minutes staring at my closed closet door, where that velvet box had remained untouched since the night of the shower. And that was when the seed that had been planted 3 years ago, the one that had quietly twisted its roots into the soil of my silence, finally broke the surface. I didn't want to scream. I didn't want to throw things or accuse her or start a family war that would never end. I wanted to prove something. I wanted her to feel what I had felt, that sting of being made invisible, of having your story rewritten in front of your eyes, of being handed someone else's crumbs and told to smile like you were lucky to have them. But most of all, I wanted her to know the truth. So I went upstairs, opened the closet, and pulled out the box. The ring was still there, still nestled in its linen wrap like a sleeping animal, untouched and gleaming faintly in the soft light from the hallway. It wasn't extravagant, nothing flashy or oversized, but it was elegant, meaningful, designed with intention. A marquise-cut opal surrounded by small rose-cut diamonds on a thin gold band, slightly asymmetrical by design, meant to feel like a secret kept between two people. And even though it wasn't finished, it was unmistakably hers. Or rather, it had been meant for someone Jake once described as not like other girls, someone who deserved something unique. I took the ring, wrapped it in new linen, this time with care, not hesitation, and placed it into a small craft box with a wax seal stamped with the initial L. No note. No drama. Just the ring. The message was in the silence, in the precision of it, in the absence of commentary. But as I prepared to drop it in the mailbox the next morning, I paused, just for a moment, and added a single handwritten note folded inside the lid. "Thought this belonged to you more than me. L." There was no return address. No explanation. Just a simple, quiet offering that would land in her hands like a grenade. Because this wasn't about destroying her relationship or exposing Jake's past, not really. This wasn't about causing a scene or turning my pregnancy into a battleground. It was about reminding both of them, that before there was an engagement, before there were ring selfies and winking announcements, there had been me. And that even when I say nothing, I remember everything. And so, I mailed it. No hesitation. No second guessing. I dropped the box into the blue mailbox on the corner near the grocery store and walked away with a calm I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. Because I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made a spectacle. I hadn't demanded anything. I had simply returned what was never hers to begin with. And as I drove home, the windows down, the summer air thick with the scent of cut grass and warm pavement, I realized something else. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I had been. I was clear, focused, settled. Because the best revenge isn't loud or chaotic or wrapped in bitterness. The best revenge is knowing exactly when to say nothing and letting the silence speak for you. There is something strangely intimate about watching another person unravel, not in the theatrical, screaming at the sky kind of way you see in movies, but in that quiet, disoriented confusion that settles in when the truth slips through the cracks of a carefully constructed lie, when the version of reality someone has polished to a shine begins to buckle under the weight of a single, undeniable moment. And as I sat at the kitchen table the night after I mailed the ring, sipping slowly from a glass of lukewarm decaf that had long since stopped pretending to taste like anything but compromise, I imagined the exact second Chloe opened that box. Imagined her reaching inside with those perfectly manicured fingers of hers, expecting a candle or a bath bomb, or maybe some handmade baby clothes scent as a peace offering from the sister she assumed had once again surrendered the spotlight. But what she pulled out instead was not a trinket of affection, not some stitched-together symbol of forgiveness, but the very ring that had once passed through the hands, and possibly the heart of her fiancé, long before she'd ever entered the picture. The fallout didn't take long to reach me, though for a few hours that afternoon, I almost believed it wouldn't come at all. There was a strange stillness to the day, no texts, no calls, no updates from our mother who normally acted as an unsolicited switchboard for family gossip, and for a brief moment, I even wondered if Chloe hadn't recognized it, or worse, if she had recognized it but chose to say nothing, because doing so would mean acknowledging the fracture, the hairline crack now running through the facade of her engagement. But just after sunset, as the sky began to shift into that burnt orange that makes everything feel a little more cinematic than it really is, my phone lit up with a series of alerts that came not in a flood, but one after the other like slow, precise dominoes tipping in sequence. First a missed call, then another, followed by 3 unread messages, each more unhinged than the last. The first one read, "What the hell is this?" The second came 30 seconds later, "Tell me this isn't what I think it is." The third, longer and typed with the unmistakable fury of someone whose hands were shaking, "You're twisted. You always have been. You couldn't just let me be happy, you had to turn this into some sick game. I hope it was worth it." I didn't reply. Not because I didn't have words, I had too many, in fact, but because there was nothing I could say that would soften the truth or sharpen it any further. The point had already landed, and no amount of explanation or justification would change the fact that, in her hands, she now held proof that the fairy tale she had been selling to everyone, including herself, had a smudge on it that couldn't be wiped away with more champagne toasts or filtered engagement photos. The ring wasn't about the metal or the stone or even the design, it was about what it represented. The possibility that she had been someone's second choice, that her love story had been pre-owned, that the man she worshipped had once looked elsewhere with the same intensity he now directed at her. Whether or not he remembered, whether or not he even realized it, was beside the point. I remembered. And now she did too. An hour later, just as I was considering whether or not I should warn Tom that the night might get loud, Chloe showed up at my front door. She didn't knock, she banged, the kind of pounding that makes the walls vibrate and the dog next door start barking like it senses blood in the air. I opened the door slowly, almost lazily, not because I wasn't bracing for impact, but because I wanted her to feel the imbalance of it. Wanted her to see that I wasn't flustered or defensive or on the verge of apologizing the way she probably expected me to be. She stood on the porch in that same damn white dress she'd worn to the baby shower, though now it looked rumpled, wrinkled, and strangely smaller on her somehow, like something in her had deflated. She held the box out in front of her like it was toxic. "You're insane," she said, voice low and trembling, though whether from rage or fear or shame, I couldn't yet tell. "What kind of person does something like this?" I looked at the box, then back at her, and said nothing. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the kind of heavy, pulsing stillness that fills the air right before a storm breaks open the sky. Then she stepped forward, not fully inside the house, but close enough that I could see the sheen of sweat on her temples, and hissed, "Did you think this would make you look noble? Like you were doing me some kind of favor? You've always been jealous. Always. You couldn't just let me have one thing without trying to poison it." Her words didn't sting the way I expected them to, not because they weren't cruel, but because they were old, familiar wounds she was poking at, recycled accusations from a childhood where I was always made to feel like the background character in her play. And so I answered her with a calm I didn't know I possessed. "I just thought you deserved to know where it came from," I said, gesturing toward the ring like it was nothing more than a misplaced library book. She stared at me, wide-eyed, and for a second, I thought she might cry, not out of heartbreak, but out of humiliation, the kind that comes when the story you've been telling yourself cracks open and light starts pouring into places you never wanted exposed. But instead of breaking, she scoffed, turned on her heel, and stormed off the porch without another word. She didn't slam the door. She didn't even look back. But the silence she left in her wake was louder than any argument we'd ever had. Tom came out of the bedroom 10 minutes later, holding a glass of water and looking confused. "Everything okay?" I nodded. "She just dropped something off." He didn't ask any more questions, and I didn't offer any answers, because some things don't need to be spoken to be understood. Some truths live better in the quiet. That night, as I climbed into bed and felt Madison kick softly beneath my ribs, I stared at the ceiling and thought not about Chloe's rage or Jake's cowardice, or even the possible fallout waiting for me in the next family gathering, but about the strange, liberating peace that comes from knowing you finally told the truth in a way that cannot be denied or rewritten. And whether or not Chloe ever forgave me or herself was no longer my concern. There's something eerily anticlimactic about the moments after a confrontation you've spent years imagining, rehearsing, and bracing yourself for the kind of moment where you expect thunder, aftershocks, maybe even a public unraveling, but instead, what you get is silence, thick and unresolved, like a curtain that drops in the middle of a scene without warning or applause. In the days after Chloe showed up on my doorstep with that box clutched like it might catch fire in her hands, I kept waiting for the fallout to erupt in some visible, seismic way, an announcement called off, a family intervention. Maybe even an impromptu visit from our mother demanding an explanation for why her two daughters couldn't just get along, but none of that happened, at least not right away. What happened instead was far stranger, far quieter, and somehow more chilling. Chloe disappeared. Not in the literal sense, of course. She didn't pack up and vanish or skip town under some dramatic cloud of scandal, but socially, emotionally, atmospherically, she went dim. No more daily stories. No more curated selfies or captions with ring emojis. No public affection. No bride-to-be posts. Just a blank stretch of nothing from someone who normally lived for an audience, who fed off reactions like a performer needing applause to breathe. For an entire week, her phone went to voicemail. Her fiancé, or whatever he was at that point, didn't appear in anyone's feed either, and while I wasn't proud of it, I checked more than once, late at night when Tom was asleep and the weight of my belly made it impossible to find a comfortable position. I scrolled through her tagged photos. I looked at Jake's profile, half expecting some cryptic quote or a deleted engagement album, but there was nothing. Just the digital version of a house with all the lights off. I didn't reach out. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility to help her stitch together a lie I hadn't broken, but had simply unmasked. I wasn't the one who created the crack, I'd just pointed at it. And yet, some small, persistent voice inside me, faint but unmistakably familiar, kept whispering that maybe, in pulling back the curtain, I'd taken something from her she wasn't ready to lose. Not the ring, not even the illusion of Jake's devotion, but the story she was trying so desperately to write about her life. The perfect engagement, the doting man, the happily ever after she could parade around in high heels and group chats. And for someone like Chloe, that story was everything. When she finally resurfaced, it was not with a grand return or an emotional apology or even a cold, clipped explanation. It was with a single photograph posted exactly 8 days later, of her left hand resting on a white countertop, nails freshly painted in a muted nude, and on her ring finger sat a different band. Not the opal one. Not mine. A new ring, one I hadn't seen before, larger, flashier, studded with diamonds that sparkled a little too hard under the artificial lighting. The caption simply read, "Second chances are still worth saying yes to." No mention of Jake's name. No context. No clarity. Just a smile made of pixels and a comment section flooded with congratulations from people who would never know what that photo really meant. People who didn't know the first ring had come from a drawer in my closet. I stared at that post for what felt like an hour, letting the weight of it press against the edges of my resolve, not because I felt regret, but because I finally understood something about Chloe I'd been too angry to see before. Her world didn't run on truth. It ran on image, on control, on making sure the version of her life others consumed was tidy, enviable, and untouched by the messy reality the rest of us had to live with. And when that version was threatened, even by something as innocuous as a ring in a box, she didn't collapse, she rebooted. She rebranded. She didn't confront the truth. She replaced it. Our mother called me 2 days after the post went live, her voice careful and upbeat in that way she always used when trying to pretend something wasn't a problem. Chloe said she's planning a small engagement dinner next month, she chirped, just close friends and family. I told her of course we'd be there. Isn't that nice? Everyone's moving forward. Everyone, apparently, but me. Because as the date of that dinner crept closer and my due date loomed large on the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental between us had shifted, not just between me and Chloe, but within the family itself. Holidays suddenly felt loaded with a new kind of tension, conversations layered with subtext and glances that lingered too long. Our father, always the neutral party, began speaking less when both of us were in the room. Our mother, though never one to admit discomfort outright, began overcompensating with pleasantries so thick they made everyone feel sticky. And Chloe, though perfectly polite and smiling at all the right moments, had developed a new edge, sharp, cool, and unmistakably defensive, like a woman wearing a dress 2 sizes too small, pretending not to notice the seams straining. At the engagement dinner, she made a toast, of course. She always did. She stood beneath a string of fairy lights and thanked everyone for believing in love and supporting her and Jake through everything, a phrase that earned more than one curious glance, though no one dared ask what she meant. She didn't mention me. Not by name. Not even in passing. But at one point, her eyes met mine across the table, and for the briefest second, her smile faltered, just a flicker, like a candle in wind, and in that single flicker, I saw everything she didn't say, the grudge she would never admit to, the betrayal she'd twist into victimhood, and the resentment that would quietly calcify between us like a bone that never quite healed right. And yet, despite all of it, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't even feel angry anymore. What I felt, sitting there in that over-decorated backyard with my swollen ankles propped on an ottoman and my daughter rolling softly inside me, was something far more complicated. I felt free. Not because I'd won, but because I no longer needed her approval. No longer needed her to admit what she did. No longer needed the story to be tidy or fair or resolved. The truth was, I had given her a chance to face herself, and she'd chosen to repaint the mirror instead. So maybe that's the real revenge. Not the ring. Not the silence. Not even the sting of exposure. Maybe the real revenge is knowing I walked away with nothing left unsaid, while she'll spend the rest of her life pretending the truth was never there to begin with. And maybe, just maybe, that's the one thing she'll never forgive me for.